Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Mike Butterworth.
Yes.
I'm the director of the Center for Sports Communication and Media, part of the Moody College of Communication. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here to the 2024 McGarr Symposium on Sports and Society. And I want to start with just a few thank yous and acknowledgments, and then I will turn to introducing our esteemed panel, and then we'll get right to it after that. First and foremost, I want to just acknowledge the folks who have allowed for things to happen smoothly today. That includes our manager, Christopher Hart. That includes David Schneider and Bevo Video Productions, Keith Berner, and our tech team. We've got a whole bunch of people who make our lives very easy, so I want to start by acknowledging each of them. And also all of the support that we get in the Moody College, including our new dean, Rachel Davis-Mercy, and all of the folks that make things happen here. So big thank you to those folks. This is the McGarr Symposium on Sports and Society, and you may have noticed that we are right next to a cafe called Cappy's. Those two things actually go together. Cappy McGarr is someone who gave the very first gift in the Moody College of Communication that made sports journalism curriculum possible. And so we're grateful to Cappy for his support then and now. Unfortunately, Cappy isn't able to be at the event today, but we know he's here in spirit, and so happy to acknowledge his efforts. With that, I want to get to the exciting conversation that we're about to have, and I'll introduce each of our panelists. I suppose I'll go, well, I have them in order here already, so I'll point out, you can all wave as we go. We're here to talk about the relationship between politics and sports, especially in the context of global sports. And of course, this is 2024. You know it's an Olympic year, and we're just a couple of years away also from the next Men's World Cup. And so we've got major global events that we may be thinking of and excited about. But we're also thinking about a range of other kinds of sporting events and the various intersections between those events and politics. And we're going to see that operate at lots of different levels, both in terms of the things that we watch, the things that we study, and then also some of the programs and initiatives that each of our guests have started. So let me introduce them, and then we'll get to things. So first, I'm going in alphabetical order. So Jules Boykoff has a PhD in political science from American University and currently teaches political science at Pacific University in Oregon. He writes on a range of subjects, including political activism, the Olympic Games, and climate change. He's the author of 5 books on the Olympics and 2 books on the suppression of political dissent. Boykoff writes about academic disciplines, publishing peer-reviewed articles in fields such as political science, sociology, geography, environmental studies, and history. And his work has been published in a whole range of journals, and there are too many of them to be able to mention here. But he's also written for public outlets such as The Guardian, The New York Times, New Left Review, The Nation, The Los Angeles Times, Washington Post Extra, and Street Route. So welcome, Jules Boykoff. Next is, we can absolutely applaud each person individually. Yeah, that's appropriate. Next is Dr. Amira Rose Davis, who received her PhD in history from the Johns Hopkins University and is an assistant professor in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She specializes in 20th century American history with an emphasis on race, gender, sports, and politics. Recently named a Mellon Emerging Faculty Leader by the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, she finished up her first book, or is finishing up her first book, Can't Eat a Medal, The Lives and Labors of Black Women Athletes in the Age of Jim Crow. Her work has appeared in all sorts of scholarly journals as well, including the Radical History Review and the Journal of African American History, and also in popular outlets such as Washington Post and Slate. Davis also provides sports commentary for NPR, ESPN, and BBC, and serves on the advisory board of the Jackie Robinson Museum and the Arthur Ashe Legacy Foundation. Please welcome Amira Rose Davis. Dr. Thomas Hunt has a PhD in history, right?
No,
Kinesiology, PhD in kinesiology, my apologies, from the University of Texas at Austin, and is an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Health Education here at UT. With research interests that include sport law, history, and international relations, Dr. Hunt has published articles in, among others, the Journal of Sport History, the International Journal of the History of Sport, and the International Journal of Sport Policy and Politics. His book, Drug Games, the International Olympic Committee and the Politics of Doping, 1960 to 2008, is considered a critical text on the topic. Please welcome Dr. Hunt. Dr. Lindsay Krasnoff has a PhD in history, not kinesiology, history, from the Graduate Center at City University of New York. She is a historian, writer, speaker, and consultant who helps industry professionals be more effective communicators across the global sports arena by drawing on her deep expertise in global sports communications and diplomacy. Lindsay is a globally recognized sports diplomacy expert, pioneering work within the basketball diplomacy framework and a leading expert on French sport, notably how France became one of the major basketball pipelines for NBA, WNBA, and NCAA talent. Author of Basketball Empire, France and the Making of a Global NBA and WNBA. I believe there is some information right up front for you about that book, if you'd like. And The Making of Les Bleus, the sport in France, 1958 to 2010. She has a deep knowledge of the Fifth Republic's youth development. Please welcome Dr. Krasnoff. And Dr. Neftalie Williams holds a PhD from the University of Waikato in New Zealand and is a sociologist and assistant professor at San Diego State University. His previous positions include USC Provost's postdoctoral scholar at the Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism and Yale Schwartzman Center visiting fellow in race, culture, and community. He investigates global issues of race, diversity, identity, and youth empowerment using the lens of action sports culture and has upcoming books with Hatchet Books and UC Press focused on skateboarding culture. Williams is featured in multiple media outlets and provides commentary on the intersection of skateboarding, diversity, equity, and inclusion regarding the Olympics for the New York Times, CNN, ABC, and other outlets. Expanding the public dialogue around diversity and inclusion, Neftalie founded The Nation Skate, a series of public panels, lectures, skateboarding demonstrations, and media that explores the relationship between race, diversity, and diplomacy through skateboarding, academia, and popular culture. Please welcome Dr. Williams. I had these cards. I thought they would be very handy. All right. So I'm going to sit down now, and I'm going to leave the majority of the conversation to our outstanding panelists. I can't wait for us to hear from them. This is going to be conversational as much as possible, and then we will have some time toward the end for you all to ask questions, and so please be thinking about those and be ready for them. So let me start by referencing the fact that our description for this event references Nelson Mandela's famous praise for sports, in which he says, "Sport has the power to inspire. It has the power to unite people in a way that little else does. Sport can create hope where once there was only despair." So let's start by talking about taking Mandela's words at face value. What is it about sport that lends itself to such optimistic sentiments? And we'll go in the order in which you all choose.
All right, I'll start right now. When we're looking at that phrase, the way it really touches me is thinking through sport's one of the only ways in which we get to see the other. And that's something that, Stuart Hall has talked about that, Ben Carrington has talked about that, where sport lets you see somebody who might have a different background than you do, but you have some sort of shared sense of goal. They might be for a team that you're involved in or a team that you loved, or it could just be an activity that you used to participate in. And so you might not normally have a relationship with them, but sport gives that first seed for you to actually see the person in a different light. And so one of the ways that we talk about it in class is to really say, all our work and research should be, how do we see the other as the self? And so sport has that ability to get you to think about that, where you might just pass them by in the street, or you might have no actual background with them. But now you've got that inkling, that first way to draw some sort of humanity and shared experience.
If I could add into that, in addition to sports use as kind of this universal connector and the passions and the emotions that it creates in all of us, one of the things that I think is powerful about sports in this context is that everyone understands a little bit the cycles of emotions that go into sports. You win or you lose. If you lose, there's always the hope that you'll have better performances the next time. It is very future thinking, right? You can't dwell too much on the past in sporting performances or so forth, because you have to prepare for the next competition. And so when we talk about that in kind of the context of the hope and the light of opportunity it can give, it really kind of sparks that and fits very well within some of the conversations on sports diplomacy, which is all about hope and connecting with others.
I would add a couple things. It's one of the few areas of life that we all have some experience with. And that could be as little as picking up a a stick and a ball and throwing it as a child. That almost everybody has that experience. Music may be the other where we all share something. I'd also say, like during the Olympics, if you take 2008, Americans saw more of China than most Americans had ever seen previously in their life. And there is something, I'm skeptical about this call about sport being unifying, but there is something powerful about that. And so, yeah.
Okay, so we've done the optimism. We might detour a little bit now. I think that for me, sports is really rooted in all the other things around the landscape of sports. So if you've ever taken a class with me, we usually start with a sports autobiography. What's really easily revealed is it's not so much what you watch, but who you watch it with. A lot of our ideas and our feelings and our emotions around sport are actually tied to notions of community or region or identity or place. And I think that sports becomes a highly visible place that we can see both optimism and pessimism. We can see possibility and constraint. And it can be both a mirror to society as well as a laboratory for change. And I think that that kind of smorgasbord of chaos and what I call the murky kind of gray area, you can look at gray area as something drab, but Caleb Green invites us to think of it as like a vibrant gray, a textured gray, and that's what I think about sports. And I think about it as a critical sports scholar, but also somebody who gets, I haven't slept because I've been watching stupid Formula One cars test in Bahrain all night while also watching Avatar. So there's something still emotional about it because why am I awake watching cars test? So there's something that pulls about it, but I think that there's also this great possibility to move beyond just optimism or unification and think about in what ways can we unify around this, and then what are the roadblocks? And are those roadblocks translatable outside of the realm of sports as well? Jules.
Thank you.
Yes.
So, as the card-carrying political scientist, I want to point out an obvious political science fact, which is we are living in an intense age of hyper-polarization, where it can be incredibly difficult to have conversations with people who sit on the opposite side of the political aisle. And for me, sports are one of those zones where you can have those conversations. I don't know if any of you in the room watched the recent three-point shoot-off between Steph Curry and Sabrina Ionescu. I'm seeing some nodding out there. I watched it with great interest myself. And if you were listening to the commentators, they had a riveting and divisive discussion around whether she should have shot from the women's three-point line or the men's. It raised up all these issues, and it wasn't necessarily about unity in that moment. It was about our unified appreciation of sports, creating a space where we can have meaningful conversations, even in disagreement. And I highlight, in a moment of hyperpolarization, we often lose that. We just dismiss the other people on the other side, whereas sports can create this sort of zone for actual meaningful engagement.
I appreciate that you all gave each other a chance to add in something before we move to another question, but I feel like we can't quite get past that question just yet, based on some of those observations. I mean, a lot of those moments when we hear a challenge about whether which line Ionescu should shoot from, or who should be included or not be included, the accusation is when any of you would point that out, oh, you're being divisive. The sort of default setting is that sports is inherently unifying, and it's only those of us who would dare to point out the problems that are guilty of being divisive. How do you reconcile that tension? Because it's clear that everybody on the panel still kind of loves sports in different ways, maybe not. And so how do you reconcile that tension?
Well, anybody who tells you that sports aren't political needs to check and look in the mirror and think a little bit more deeply about it. And second, anybody who says that, you might look where their paycheck's coming from, because there's a lot of people out there who have a vested interest in saying that sports are apolitical or neutral. So maybe that's a jumping off point there.
I'll just support that. You're correct about the paychecks and these are sport, as we say, the sport industrial complex, right? We know how that exists here at the college level, how it exists in the professional level, how there's a difference between the college level here and the college level in Europe, right? Like where the sports exists in the club. So like right off the bat, there's always a decision that's being made about what path sport's going to take. Now, I will say this, my work and research is focused on skateboarding action sports culture. So I always sit like sort of at the edge, which is why I sat on the edge here, because it is different in skateboarding action sports culture because we are just getting into that space. So the way that I tend to think of it is like skateboarding and skateboard in particular exists in the space of marginalized sport. I'm sure everyone in the room can think about what marginalized might mean. And so in this instance, it's like, well, we don't have access to the resources to be on TV all the time. We're not Monday Night Football. We're not Thursday night. We're not Saturday, which is college. So right off the bat, the way that we are seeing each other is different because we're like, oh, it's hard to actually get to be part of this sport, to be part of this activity. So it builds a community. And that's like kind of different than when you have like historic sums of money and a longer history. And so there's like good things and bad to that. But the way we reconcile it is by saying like, hey, if you're participating in the sport, we really do have a lot in common because I know that you will get stopped by the police on campus for skating a spot, that you don't have access to skate parks or resources, and you're still choosing to do this. So like no matter what, like, hey, we have a friend and we have a shared experience just in that marginalization. And we look at traditional sports and go like, okay, what do they do right? What do they do wrong? And like, what can we learn as we're in the Olympics? We're in the Olympics for 2021 and 2024. Like, how can we take this history that they all have and do something new with it that can affect social change? So we're always on that fluid mode.
And I don't think tension's a bad thing inherently. I got into studying sports because I was an athlete up until I was a freshman in college and found myself unexpectedly having a baby. And I was like, what is happening? And also, it was the first time I had to recognize, like, what does it mean to be something that wasn't an athlete, right? And so I got into researching sports around the same time. And when somebody came to me with a research opportunity and said, what do you want to study? I was like, sports, of course. But when I went to the shelves to find books on sports, they weren't there, right? They were maybe like the history of the I formation. But I was like a budding historian, and I couldn't understand how you could like write a comprehensive history of Philadelphia where I was going to college without being like, on Mondays, it's a better base to play like if the Eagles won. Like everybody has free Dunkin' Donuts, everybody's smiling. That feels like a big part of understanding the city, right? And so a lot of the work that I do and that we've done, in collaboration is actually born out of this foundation of like loving this thing, right? Jessica and I, this is Jessica Luther, she's very great. You should know her if you don't. Jessica and I, for 5 years, co-hosted a feminist sports podcast called Burn It All Down, and oftentimes we would get like, why do you want to burn down? You must hate sports. It's like, no, it's like precisely because we love it too much, right? Like that we want to have these conversations. And so I think the tension around consuming sports while you turn your brain off and consuming sports while you're also like thinking and feeling and being like a fully actualized human being is not a bad tension. And Jessica wrote a great book, and this is the last time I'll do this, but you did write a great book called Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back, and with Kavitha Davidson, and I think that it actually gets to the heart of this tension, which is each chapter allows you and invites you into this discussion that we're having right now. We're modeling it. It's really an invitation to consume and love sports and love them enough to also ask questions of them.
And just tapping into that, tension in around sports and some of these conversations is not a bad thing. And sometimes because sports are one of the few domains, I think, where you can have conversations and discussions and not automatically shut down because of our very siloized and polarized place, you can actually have that opportunity to influence and maybe not totally change someone's mind, but maybe share with them how you think or how you frame a certain issue. And they'll walk away from that conversation, maybe not totally, thinking the same way you do, which is fine, but having a better, more nuanced understanding. I just had an example of this. I recently went to France. I'm doing a research project on French soccer and how they're training up the Iraqi women's national team. And when I told my family where I was going and what I was doing, there were some very kind of heated, charged questions about, what was I, why were the Iraqis and would I be safe, and all kinds of things that really spoke to misheld or older stereotypes that are no longer really valid. But it wound up opening that up to a larger conversation and to share, this is what it is, this is what it is about. These are the women who are participating, and they're vastly different from maybe how you've been led to think about them in the news media or in other things. And so while I didn't totally change my family's mind, very much got them to see a different aspect of the issue at hand. And so sports, I think, are one of the few arenas in which we can do that with some modicums of success.
I would add, I mentioned being skeptical about the unifying and positive aspects of sport. And I think all of us in this panel are very much aware of that. The more we know, in a way, about corruption in sport, or about drugs in sport, or about rape in sport and manipulation in sport, it is easy to become a skeptic. At the same time, if you watch Mike's kid play baseball, you realize that there's something special and still something pure and something positive going on, or watching my son Vincent play tennis. I'll say that there is nothing inherently evil about sport. In the same way, there's nothing inherently positive. But sport can be done in a way that is positive, and it can be done in a way that is negative. And so I think there's a hope here to try and provide critiques that lead to a better outcome. I think that is what drives many of us. So, yeah.
So there's some recurring themes here that there's something about sports that allows us to have access to ideas and conversations that we can't get to through any other means, although maybe music is a good parallel space. But if we're thinking in terms of things like sports diplomacy, like as we've gestured in the title of the program, what is it about sports that facilitates certain diplomatic steps or relationships that we can't access through other diplomatic means, if anything? Clearly, there's a belief that from people planning some of these things that there can be, and so I'm curious to know what sports gives us that other things can't give us.
So I worked for the U.S. Department of State for many years, and as in the historian's office, but always a big supporter of their sports diplomacy division. One of the things I did was I did sports, what we would today call sports diplomacy briefings with some of our ambassadors before they'd go overseas, getting them to think about how they could tap into the power of sport to engage with local populations on the ground. And there were, yes, most of the ones who requested those briefings were from Boston, where I grew up, and very much understand the power that sports have to forge community across a lot of different identities or more divisive identifiers. But very much what sports diplomacy offers from a diplomatic or government standpoint is the ability to interact and engage with the everyday person on the street. You are getting beyond the realms of the government elites or the business elites that are a little bit more typical in some of those domains, and you're able to engage with everyday people in the country where you're working. And that comes with a certain degree of authenticity, that you're getting to engage with people more differently. And I've experienced this myself working on the ground in France within sports and on the basketball book. By getting to know the basketball community in France and its ties to the US, I came away with a far better, more nuanced understanding and appreciation of what the French people are like today, in a way that I never did when I was working for the government or when I was doing my academic and my PhD research and operating only within academic circles. I came into contact with all types of different people, and I think that speaks a lot to the ways that sports diplomacy can be a very useful tool, whether it's being used formally by governments, by embassy officials, heads of states, local organizing committees, or whether it's being used informally in non-official ways in citizen-to-citizen exchanges, pretty much anyone operating within the international global sports arena.
I would love to answer this historically and talk a little bit about some of the research I do, which is that that this has been a way historically for Black athletes to play with the tension of representing a country that does not represent them all the time, right? Or love them or consider them fully citizens all the time. And so one of the things that we see through understanding this history is the logics of sports diplomacy historically developed. And so one of the things, if you consider a kind of Cold War decolonial framework at a time where you had emerging superpowers facing off and a lot of other emerging independent nation states, this feeling of like, is the world going to go to communism? It's going to be capitalist, like what's going on? There was a lot of ways that the US State Department, the US Information Agency sought to use Black Americans to try to circumvent Soviet propaganda. And jazz tours, as Peggy Von Eschen has written about, was like, you know, where they went to music. And one of the things that happened internally is they deemed a lot of these other attempts too political. And so sports and youth choir groups, but we'll focus on the sports aspect right now. Sports became a really great mechanism precisely because it flirted with this idea that it was an apolitical space, precisely because they could run stuff through athletes that wouldn't get highlighted or knocked, right? Like people are not naive. So I write about Wilma Rudolph going to Senegal, right, at the time that they're trying to do a private business accord and incentivize relationships in Senegal. And people in Senegal are not naive. They know why the United States is trying to get there. And they are shutting down other means of getting access in Dakar to businesses, to politicians. But the one thing that Senegalese politicians were happy to accept from the United States was around athletics. Why? Because if you're a new nation state, how are you going to prove yourself on the world scene? You are going to try to get into the Olympic movement. You're trying to have that platform, right? And so the people in the USIA said, you know, the person on the ground for us in this space was Wilma Rudolph. Like we could have access through that. Like sports opened doors that were otherwise closed. And so historically, you have both a calculation about sports diplomacy towards what Lindsay was saying about opening doors to everyday people and things like that, but you have a political calculation about what that platform could afford. And then for Black athletes doing this, you had a heightened visibility and a moment in which you could play in this area of like, well, now you're claiming me. Now you're calling me American. Now you're emphasizing my achievements. What can I do with that platform? How can I use that to push for rights? Or how can I talk about that discrepancy now when I come home and it all vanishes to bolster my claim to humanity and to citizenship? And so I think historically, the use of sports diplomacy has also opened up other avenues for petitioning of human rights or for calling out systems of oppression in that way.
It also opens up the opportunity for countries that might not have the same sort of resources as the United States to, quote unquote, punch above their weight. Here I'm thinking specifically of national teams, past as well as present. And you know, you mentioned Senegal in the immediate post-independence period. Senegal developed a brand, an identity as being the African continental powerhouse in basketball from the 1960s through the early 1980s, not just in the men's side, but especially on the women's side, and was highly influential for a few generations and allowed them to have that national pride and identity in the immediate post-colonial, post-independence phase.
Okay, so I'll just add to this a little bit. So when we're not being scholars, so my other job is to be an envoy for the U.S. Department of State for skateboarding. So the things that they're just talking about historically, so that's my other job. I'm actually on my way to Paris in March to actually go do different clinics and demonstrations and talk about skateboarding's role as a tool for cultural diplomacy. When they're talking about that tension, like now you're thinking, you're like, oh, all right, so this African-American professor has all of the weight in that history of being African-American. Like, how does that translate when you're out in the field? So as Lindsay was saying, there's doing it with the state. So sometimes I'm with the U.S. government doing it, and at other times I was the chairman or executive director for Cuba Skate. And in that Cuba Skate, we didn't have great relations. We still don't have great relations with Cuba. But in that instance, that was a humanitarian effort because there are no skate parks. There are no skate shops, and skateboards aren't created on the island. So in that's actually a gift from from the U.S. but also around the world, skateboards to give out to kids, which we just bring in giant bags as big as we are over and actually do demonstrations. We bring pros back and forth as educational exchange because our countries aren't having good relations. So I'm kind of always in both practitioner and scholar of what's happening, but also bringing those new practices back and forth. When I did my first, just to give you an idea, one of the first things I did was working with the refugees, the Syrian refugees who'd been granted asylum in the Netherlands. And at that time, the U.S. was like, we can't really do anything. We can't really do anything big, but we want them to know that we support them. And so that was my job, is to go and be in the Netherlands and do that clinic and do that with them. But I was also teaching them at the same time because I brought in skaters who were from Belgium, from Spain to also do that. And the State Department was going, oh, well, I hadn't thought about it that this new sport has already been a marginalized sport that already has a community. So when we did the event, they actually got to be embraced by other countries at the same time. And I also worked with the skate shops and the skate parks that were there, and literally them saying, like, listen, you're here in the Netherlands now, and you're a skateboarder. So you have a home. You can come to any skate park, anywhere. We'll make sure that you're taken care of. So these are just ways in which, like, that global sense of sport and community, like recognizing the other as the self and like doing that. But I do have that tension all the time of like, obviously, I'm sure you're all thinking it right now. It's like, hey, I get a million questions of like what the U.S. is doing right, what is doing wrong, the history of sports diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, so like all of those things. But the good part is to be able to take all of that data and like really those experiences and make it so that I can, teach my students, teach other folks, so that every iteration of sports diplomacy gets better because we have those sort of hard data and those experiences coming in.
So far we've had a great opportunity to hear about some individual initiatives, some State Department initiatives or governmental initiatives. We haven't yet gotten into the mix the international sport governing bodies. It seems to me that might be where stuff gets especially interesting. I wanted to share an observation from Thomas Bach, who is the current IOC president. And in the wake of moving the 2020 Summer Olympics to 2021 because of COVID, when the Tokyo Games were completed, for a lot of people who were involved in staging that, there was a great deal of satisfaction in having been able to actually execute the games under those conditions. But this is what Thomas Bach said after that. This accomplishment. This is the unifying power of sport. This is the message of solidarity, the message of peace, and the message of resilience. This gives us all hope for our future journey together. And it seems to me that even under the best of circumstances, that's just a grand overstatement, especially coming from an organization like the IOC. So let's use that moment as an opportunity to think about the role of these international sporting bodies and how those factor into efforts to literally bridge divides and bring people together versus the ways that certain political inequalities might be exacerbated.
Well, since you mentioned the International Olympic Committee by name, I would like to start off by kind of linking it to my previous comment. The International Olympic Committee benefits tremendously from the Olympics monetarily. They made $7.6 billion over that Olympic cycle period, and so they're one of those groups with a vested interest. And they actually managed to create unity in Japan going into those Olympics, just maybe not in the way that they thought they were, in the sense that a poll found just 3 months before the games that 83% of the population in Japan did not want to hold the Olympics. 83%. It's hard to find any issue where 83% of the population agrees. Why were they like that? Well, first of all, the games had already been postponed, and yet they were still under-vaccinated at that point. Japan was way behind places like the United States, so there was a real fear that you were going to bring people in from all around the world, potentially bring in COVID and cause real problems. Well, Thomas Bach and other people at the International Olympic Committee, they promised that everything was going to be just fine. There'd be no problems with transmission. They were going to create a quote-unquote Olympic bubble. How did that Olympic bubble go? Well, first of all, more than 800 people inside of the Olympic bubble got COVID. We don't know how many got long COVID. To my knowledge, it was never really traced out. So the bubble was porous, if you will. At the same time, hosting a big event like this might have created some unity, but it also structured permission for people to go out in society and watch the events out in public or get together with their friends and watch it on the TV. The rates of COVID spiked among the general population in Japan. Astride all that, and this is the last point I'll make because I know lots of people have things to say about this. Astride all that, the International Olympic Committee said this is going to be this wonderful event, everyone's going to be safe, and also at the same time that they did that, they sent out waivers to each and every athlete who was participating in Tokyo 2020. One of those athletes, and I need to be really careful about how I state this so I don't reveal their identity, they leaked this document to me. And that document said very clearly in black and white on the paper, if you die of COVID-19, you cannot sue the International Olympic Committee nor the organizers of the Tokyo Olympics. And so there's a lot more going on beneath the surface of that kind of fluffy, happy-faced remark from Thomas Bach, but I'll stop there.
No one else wants to take that up. I mean, we've got to have some more thoughts about the governing bodies, right? Not just the IOC, but go for that one if you want.
I would add, the $7.6 billion. Well, that's a lot of money, and that happens every Olympic cycle. The other kind of dimension I would add is that the Olympics in particular have adopted international harmony and bringing people together as part of the brand. It is part of the brand. Well, it's part of the brand that is the most lucrative in the world, and I think that has to be part of it as well. Protecting the brand at all costs is a really powerful motivator, and that would be just the other piece of it.
My favorite quote is actually before we even get to 2021. Yeah, before we get to 2020, held in 2021, when it was real 2020, March 2020. Stage 1 of the pandemic, season 1, when the IOC was hesitant to pull it because of the money wrapped up in it, right? You had Olympic officials in Greece saying the flames of the Olympic flame will extinguish any pandemic, any virus, right? Has no chance against the might of the Olympic flame, which is just delusional, right? But I think it goes to this idea that what is wrapped up in this belief of the brand. And so what happens is any challenge to that, right, is never met on merit. It's all, no, this is about harmony, right? No, this is why do you hate harmony? Why do you hate peace? That becomes the counter to critiques of the IOC. And the IOC is what I call part of the big bads, right? So FIFA, right, the IOC, the FIA, if you care about Formula One, which I do. And FIA, okay, hold on, tangent. FIA is really great to add to this discussion for a few reasons, but the one that I really want to point out is that when we talk about these international governing bodies like the IOC and FIFA, because it's secular, right, we tend to have a lot of conversation around corruption, right? The World Cup's in Qatar, let's have a conversation about it, and then it kind of drops out of view, right? Maybe you hear rumblings of deaths, migrant labor deaths, and maybe you hear rumblings about payoffs, and then it kind of goes out of view, and then we wait 2 years and you get some Netflix docs about corruption, and then we start the cycle again. We do it for the Olympics. It's the same thing. The FIA does this with Formula One for now, 24 races this year, 24 conversations that we don't have to wait, right? It's every time, and it really models it. So one of the things that happens with the Olympics is that if you're Jules and you're on the ground with No Olympics LA and you're doing this work, you always see the sentiment rise. But that spotlight comes in when everybody starts caring about it. So right now we're in an Olympic year. You'll keep hearing that. Maybe you've seen the Peyton Manning commercial, right? The rumble about the Olympics has begun. And that invites a spotlight that also gives platforms to start critiquing it. And then it kind of trickles out. And so being able to talk about these governing bodies, not just on their terms, in the moment of everybody being excited to watch a random sport at 4 a.m. that you have no idea what it is, but now you're going to know everything there is to know about sports climbing, right? Which is, by the way, a fascinating sport. But I think that these governing bodies have a very similar playbook, right? So it's about the brand, certainly, but it's also about how to obscure power behind this love of sport, behind this organization of sport, behind this belief that their organizing philosophy, right, shields them from looking at the money, the politics, the influence.
Okay, so I just wanted to sort of pose some other things for us to be thinking. All of these things are true, okay, that they're saying. So looking at where action sports, particularly skateboarding, surfing, where those are situated, because now it's also like we spend a lot of time critiquing. I critique, like that's our job, that's our gig. However, at the same time, I am the envoy for the State Department, and I worked in several different countries, like thinking about what sport can be in those positions. Okay, so for the Olympics, there was a boycott. The skaters signed a petition to keep skateboarding out of the Olympics, and it literally says all the things that they've just said that's wrong with the Olympics. They're like, why would we want to be there in the first place? Like, look at all these corrupt practices, like the migrant workers, the federations. Like, this is garbage. Like, and if anything, we've been the anti-sport for a long time. So why would we want to adopt any of these principles that they're talking about? Like, we do it on our own. However, one thing that's really important to pull is, during that petition, I think it was 3,500 signatures to keep us out of it. That was also coming from like white Western countries, and it was predominantly male. And so one of the things that happens, particularly in skateboarding, bless you, is that while sport in the U.S. like does a lot of things wrong, we do have Title IX, right? So there are ways to think about these things, and we don't have. There's no Title IX. There's nothing that says there needs to be equity in skateboarding culture, but the Olympics does require us to do that. So that created a huge boost for the women's movement in skateboarding, because people could be pro women skateboarders. Like, they could get as much money that the guys were getting. So, contests in the Olympics actually changed a whole bunch of different brands who never had any women on the team. And now they're like, do you know any good female skaters? And now they're, not only were they scrambling, but they were starting to cultivate them now. And the group that was actually at the Olympics, some of them, I have friends who were skating there. It's, from like ages 9 and up, right? So like the Olympics did that for us. We tried to keep it out of the Olympics. There's a big push to not be involved because the IOC there's a lot of issues that go on. But also when I'm working in Cuba I can tell you the exact conversation. They're not happy that Americans are here giving out skateboards or doing these clinics. Why? Because it's a communist state or a communist nation, and in that, the state shall provide, right? The state's supposed to give you food, housing, shelter, and take care of you. So us being on the ground, like giving out things, like literally, we talk to the government, and the Cuban representatives will say like, hey, we don't hate this, but you don't have enough skateboards for the entire island, and everything needs to be like, this is communism. We all have to do it. So like, here's where skateboarding is being like a little bit of a tool for a U.S. agenda, right? But it also, they don't get mad at us, and we're still at work there, is because they go, well, the Olympics are coming. Cuba does think about itself as a sporting nation, and there's a whole bunch of countries that are like that. Like, I work in South Africa, I work in Brazil. Lots of different countries are thinking about their future sporting identity. Well, as you said, like, your history can be wrapped up in that. So there's room for that to play out in a good way, whereas everyone who's boycotting it already gets to have the kind of self-expression that they want, right? If everyone is white Western countries, they're like, I don't need that. Yeah, you don't, because you can do whatever you want. You have the leisure, right? And in other countries where like, hey, like skateboarding is not like looked upon favorably, there now becomes this new opportunity, and the Olympics did that. And particularly with not to take up too much time, sorry, but with skateboarding, it was in Japan, and Japan cleaned up. And I did so many interviews before the Olympics where literally, the hosts were just saying to me, hey, isn't America just gonna like run this? Isn't it gonna be embarrassing? And I was like, oh, I'm so excited for everyone to see how global skateboarding is. Brazil is gonna crush it. I hope we do well as America, but I'm not sure. Like, Japan's on top, like, it could be crazy. And, well, that's exactly what happened. Like for us in the US, like, we barely made the podium. Jagger Eaton got bronze, but like, it was a little sketchy. But it was also beautiful because people got to see like, oh, I thought it was just like blonde-haired, blue-eyed surfers in California. Instead, they're like, whoa, this is like a global phenomenon. And then one last thing that happened was in the women's park contest, the thing that was really emancipatory was that they got off the podium. All the winners of all the medals, those young girls were like, oh, we don't do that. We're here together. We're athletes, but we are friends. And this is what skateboarding is a community. So they did all their photos together, and literally the LA Times piece was, the opinion piece was, the best sport at the Olympics, skateboarding, because they saw everybody from every nation celebrating each other, going crazy, throwing their boards, knocking over camera people to hug each other in the bottom of the ramp. They're like, oh, this is what the Olympics is supposed to look like. This is what sport's supposed to look like. So there is an argument that we went and continued to be ourselves. And I look at traditional sport and go like, huh, yeah, we should be there because we can remind people of what it should look like.
This is the tension that I love, right, to sit in, because it's an invitation to think about, like, sometimes when we come up with sports, we think it's always how it's been, which is like why we like history, right? Because we get to be like, wow. And I think like these are the great kind of moments to be able to be like, what is possible under the current sporting bodies and what is not, and what has been possible and what was closed down, right? And so thinking about the Olympic movement is really instructive if we want to analyze gender on this point, right? So athletics, running, right? Women were not, you could do other sports, but you could not run, right? This was the prevailing sentiment. And women wanted to participate in the Olympics in athletics, running, right? And so they had a meeting with the sporting bodies, and they were like, absolutely not, you cannot run. And so the women were like, fuck it, we'll make our own Olympic Games where we can run. And a lot of people were like, they're not gonna go pop off or whatever, and then they did. And so the Women's World Games were born in 1924, well, 22, and then they held them again in 24, and it had the Olympics shook, right? They were like, oh my gosh, all these women were running, and they were just doing it even outside of our oversight, right? And so part of this is a simplified history, I hope you know that, but this is the Cliff Notes version. But one of the things that happened in that is they said, okay, well, we'll bring you back on the fold so we can regulate you, right? If you drop this competition. Don't call it the Women's Olympics anymore, really like kind of phase it out. And so in 1928, you have women's athletics included, but the distances are restricted, right? You get that restriction. We see this in multiple ways. We can see this, the Copa America in 1971 packed over 100,000 people into Azteca Stadium, right? To see women play soccer at a time when many countries were banning women from playing soccer. This was 20 years before FIFA would host the Women's World Cup, right? So that existed before the regulation and platform of FIFA, right? But now sometimes it's easy to think, well, FIFA's the goal. Well, we have to get recognition from FIFA. We have to get this from FIFA. When FIFA have shown that they do not care about the Women's World Cup, right? Over and over and over again. And so being able to recognize the longevity of those possibilities allows those questions about like, what does a future for women's soccer look like if we can also think about it through how it's entangled with FIFA and how it benefits that, like what platforms does that provide, like those stories, and what constraints does it. And the last example of this is the NCAA with women's college basketball, women's sport in general, that spent a decade trying to avoid managing women's sports. And then once they realized they were losing all those lawsuits, crushed the organizations that were already in place managing it and implemented their own vision. So the question that we get to sit in and the tensions we get to sit in are, how did we come to this current governance of sports? What does it help? Like what possibilities are created under current governance models? And where are the loopholes, where are the problems? And I think that that's a way to sit in the tension and figure out where do we go from here in terms of what reform looks like or what burning all down looks like, right? Wherever you fall on it, but you have to be able to do that kind of longevity work to see the possibilities.
One thing I would add, just for consideration as we talk about this, and I think it picks up on some of these points, is that some of these big baddies, I don't know if I personally would use that term, but I understand very much where it comes from, is that there are some things that they do well that are beneficial. For example, FIFA has a significant development investment fund where they are fueling the growth of the game, including the women's game, maybe not everywhere around the world, but in a lot of places that otherwise would not have those opportunities, would not have the finances, would not have access to the technical expertise. So there are, the very fair critiques and well needed examinations, but also to keep in mind that there are some things that some of these larger governing bodies do that do help to ameliorate the situation for all.
So I think one of the great things about the examples that are coming through here is it gives us insight into thinking about sports as a site for potential acts of resistance, which allows us to think about sports and politics beyond sort of the obvious political activist or the obvious political statement, because not standing on the medal stand doesn't immediately sound political, but clearly has political potential and substance. So I'm curious, I want to use that to ask the group if you might comment on, especially in light of, we clearly had a peak 3-4 years ago of athlete activism and attention on the possibility for what athletes could do to change sports. And feels like we perhaps have ebbed away from that in various ways. So what are those spaces, those possibilities for athletes, especially in a global context, to use the platform of sports to model possible change?
I would say that athletes, and I'm not sure it has totally yet, but athletes have a lot of leverage, and I think they're figuring that out. I'm not sure they truly appreciated that in the way that they do. The college athletes now, you see the amount of enormous leverage that they possess. And I think they've sort of been blinded by the rhetoric around sport in a way that made them powerless. And it's pretty cool to see it reverse. And I hope it continues and doesn't ebb.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just really happy to talk about courageous athlete activists who are standing up and pushing out against power. And one that's really been on my mind quite a lot lately is Nagam Abu Samra, the karate champion from the Palestinian territories, Gaza. And she was a representative. She started clinics for young girls. I wrote down a quote because I was really moved by it. She said, I wanted every girl to feel her strength from within. And she brought all these girls into her karate school, regardless of whether they could pay. And she was just an amazing inspiration, sports diplomacy in a certain respect, or at least outreach in its most powerful form. She's been on my mind because unfortunately she lost a leg in December from bombing by the Israeli Defense Forces and then passed away in January. And yet her message rings from the grave as super important and super powerful. And she's not alone in this moment. I think we are seeing a rise of athletes, even today, standing up. And one that I would just suggest, one group of athletes to keep an eye on moving forward, is this group called Global Athlete. They did this really interesting study a couple of years ago where they compared the amount of revenues that Olympic athletes received compared to other leagues like the National Basketball Association, the National Football League, the English Premier League of football or soccer. And what they found was in those other leagues, athletes were getting between 45 and 60% of the revenues, 45 and 60%. What Global Athlete found that is when it came to Olympic athletes, it was 4.1%. And athletes saw that from the Olympic sphere and were like, wait, what? I thought I was underpaid, but wow, that is really something else. And so what you're seeing out of those results is activists linking arms and standing up together to get more money, bigger piece of the Olympic money pie, and to stand up for their rights when it comes to these other issues around safety and abuse. And so I think there's both an individual who's inspiring, but there's also this group that I think will be really interesting to keep an eye on, especially as we move toward the Paris Olympics this summer.
And I think you're right, Tommy. Like, it's ebbed and like it can feel like that because sometimes we talk about athletic activism by only looking at the top, right? We look at professional sports, high-profile collegiate sports, but like these examples are really like where we've seen this kind of wave of athletic activism brew is in youth sports. It's in these other sports. I really appreciate you, bringing this up. There's an organization, there's a great article in our latest issue of American Quarterly, which was a sports issue, about a Palestinian skateboarding group. It talks about using skateboarding in as an act of radical joy in an occupied space, where we're seeing the possibilities of athletic activism through spaces that we're not trained to look at, right? And so it's these, whether it's a sport that we don't necessarily consider, or in a space or at a level, right, that we're not trained to look at, we're actually seeing the kind of ignition, that fire that started in the renaissance of activism, which, to be clear, was born out of a renaissance of grassroots activism inspired by the murder of Trayvon Martin, right? The same way that we have athletic activism in the 60s really being like the Emmett Till generation in the classical civil rights era, the Trayvon Martin generation that launched grassroots activism across the board, and the movement for Black Lives is what started and gave rise to athletic activism that we saw, just to be clear on that. And that rumbled in a way that trickled down, and so we're seeing new interpretations and new possibilities of athletic activism that was also then just like amplified in the pandemic. So Global Athlete, one of the ways that they were able to maneuver, and like things like We Are the Sport and stuff like that, is because when the world stopped, people could get on Zoom and suddenly have time and space without training and without kind of being in the thick of it. And time zones are a bitch, to like figure out how to like actually talk to people, to mobilize in new ways. There was new possibilities that engendered themselves during this moment, the same way we saw college athletes also do that in this moment of the pandemic. So there was a kind of meeting point that has exploded it, and now we're kind of still watching where the pieces are falling.
You know, you just reminded me, I was thinking of one other thing, you know, because I'm always, again, I'm in that spot where our sport is now in this public eye and deciding what to do, right? Like how can you use this, I'm sure everyone knows, the Olympics does not like activism, right? Like you sign the waiver, you're not supposed to do any activism. However, like Alana Smith was in the Olympics skating in the women's park, but Alana used that time to, on your board, there's space on your grip tape, to have their pronouns written. And so Alana, the entire time, just kind of skated around the course and didn't try to compete very hard, actually used that time and used that space to point to their pronouns on the board throughout basically their whole run. So that was a moment like also where people were like, whoa, I didn't know that the skaters were like interested in these kinds of things, right? And also, the truth is it does still fit within us, within who we are, right? It's still in our DNA to go like, oh, we got the camera on us, so we might as well use it. And so that was like a really good example of like just taking the stage and doing it and not caring about the performance, because Alana literally is gender non-binary and said, I already made it to the Olympics, so it didn't matter, and it doesn't mean that much, especially when we just think about like the comparison for a person who's an athlete. The Olympics stands for elite sport, right? It's the best. We talk about it in class all the time. But what happens when your sport it's not about being the best. It's about what you add to the fabric of the community. So in those instances, you can go to the Olympics and you can medal, or you could just be happy to go to the Olympics and be excited that you went and say I'm gonna use this opportunity to discuss being gender non-binary with the rest of the world. Because my community doesn't care if I'm first or second or third, we're literally gonna go skate together when this is done. So these other opportunities that are there to take the stage and just do something good with it and inspire other sports who are I got so many calls from other sports who are y'all out there acting out, so, and it was great, it was really a new way for people to think about what their activism can look like. And just the fact that you have a skateboard or something else that's not just the jersey, you're bringing in something that they're not really regulating all that much. So, we still get to be subversive, and that's what all the scholars asked before we went to Olympics. Oh, you guys used to be cool, used to be edgy. Now you're at the Olympics. Just, slow your roll, player, slow your roll. I got you.
All right, so we've moved from thinking about the state to international sporting organizations to the athletes. I want to move us back to the state for a moment. One of the other terms that we've gestured to in the title is sports washing, which really is a very recent introduction to the vocabulary in academic work and in sports journalism. So I'd like to open the conversation for you all to describe the process of or the phenomenon of sports washing, help our audience understand what that is, but then also gesture to the reasons why we're concerned about what sports washing means, especially in global sports.
I'd be happy to take this one. And I think you deserve a lot of credit for pairing sports diplomacy with sports washing. Not everybody has the wherewithal to put those two together, and I think it's interesting. So sports washing is when political leaders use sports events to try to stoke nationalism, burnish their reputations on the global stage, and to deflect attention from chronic social issues or human rights woes that are plaguing your society. Of course, they happen in places like Beijing when they host the 2022 Winter Olympics, or Russia hosting the 2014 Olympics in Sochi, or the 2018 World Cup of men's soccer. But they also happen in putative democracies such as the United States. And it happens, Super Bowl is another really interesting example of how kind of brushes these things under the carpet. The Los Angeles Olympics are another interesting example. So it can happen in both spaces. Everyone on the panel could give really interesting examples. The other thing I would say that is just something to think about is when we try to ponder the question of whether sports washing works or not, we might want to think about whether it works on a foreign audience, but also whether it works on a domestic audience. And so when Sochi hosted those 2014 Olympics, they were under a ton of pressure because of an oppressive LGBTQ law, anti-LGBTQ law that they had passed. And so they used those Olympics to basically, between the Olympics and the Paralympics, Vladimir Putin and Russia invaded Crimea, like totally exploded the Olympic truce in half. And he got super popular ahead of those Olympics. That's the point, is that sports washing works on a domestic audience. As those Olympics came closer, you can see the data from Levada in Russia. His polling numbers start going up and up and up as he's standing in front of the world stage, looking important with people from around the world. Everything's looking good. His domestic population's like, yeah, maybe there really is something to this guy. He had low poll numbers before. He uses that as a trampoline for war. And I think that gets to your last part of this question. It's not just us sitting inside the sphere of sport wondering about these things. They have serious real-world implications in potential, and a classic example is when Russia invaded Crimea between the Olympics and Paralympics.
And like every time Russia hosts a mega event, there is a corresponding action with driven up popularity.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just Russia. You see it with like countries that are democratically elected officials in real elections that use it as well.
Now, Jules Boykoff does have one of the definitive articles in the field of sports sociology, but because that is in the Sociology of Sport Journal, if I remember correctly.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So as a political scientist, but still crossing the disciplinary boundaries. But can you all speculate outside the academic conversation why and how that term has emerged in popular media more recently? Because we don't often have that happen for us as academics, where the language we speak is suddenly a popular circulation.
I would just say because people start smelling something rotten, I mean, that's what happens. People are starting. You're all more active. You're actually thinking about what's happening in the world, and you might love sports, but you're like, wait a minute, this is a place that we just talked about in class that maybe has lots of human rights abuses. Why is the thing that I love taking place in that space? And so, like, whose money, what exchange, like, what's going on here? And so we're in a spot right now where people care, right? Like, we really sort of hit a, not a pinnacle, but we're in a good upswing where people want things to be better, simply so that you can actually enjoy the game or whatever it is that you want, even if at its minimum level of like, I can't enjoy this, I can't watch the Super Bowl. I mean, we said it in class the other day. I'm watching the Super Bowl where everyone's excited, it's the Super Bowl, blah, 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 but we still our first discussion is still, but Colin Kaepernick still doesn't have a job, right? And so it doesn't matter the amount of helmets that say end racism or whatever the case is. Like, we just made this decision on Tuesday that, like, no matter what, you can't get out of that because he doesn't have a job. And so as much as he sparked new thinking in the NFL, I'm sure you all remember when it was a horrible controversy. And then all of a sudden now it's like, oh, we've got to do the right thing. We've got to spend money and, we're going to recognize.
And racism above the Chiefs.
Right, exactly. So like that happening, so there's just no way we can't, you can't square that. He doesn't have a job. He helped people get to another stage of thinking that I'm sure everyone in this room is at. on the same page on that. And there it is, right? That's there. Things are not hunky dory, and people know that now. And even just there's a contest. I won't say where, but there was a contest that was supposed to be for the Olympic qualifier for skateboarding. It was supposed to be the first week of February, but because the country that was supposed to be placed in has some human rights abuses, particularly harsh LGBTQ laws, well, that contest wasn't going on, and that contest got moved, and it's going to be in a different place because our athletes didn't feel safe. Now, there's something kind of crazy about where it will be because they're building an entire, not just a skate park, but the way here an island for the skate park to be on, so that it's not necessarily having to deal with some laws from particular countries to make it easier for the athletes. But I definitely don't think we should be, well, I'll just leave it at that. That's its own spending, its own thing. So, that's.
We haven't talked about the
thinking a little
environment too much, but that sounds like an invitation to do it.
Yes.
But anyway, go ahead, Tom.
I'm struck by the public gets its information from different places than it did when I was a kid. I lament the death of newspapers and investigative journalism, even in small cities and medium towns. But there is so much information, and we are so connected to the internet. There's a real democratization of news and of reporting, where on Twitter, an everyday person could report what they're seeing. And so I think the way information spreads is different, and I think there's something to that in terms of the language that we talk, like sports washing. When I was in the 80s, maybe that would not have been able to become a widespread term in the way that it is now.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think technology has a huge role that it plays here. And then I also think that it moves the discussion along. So around the Qatar World Cup, we saw it really kind of spike in terms of this kind of collective understanding of sport washing conversation around it. But one of the things I'm really interested in is even as it started to kind of manifest, there was another discourse around it, which is like a way that we only wanted to talk about sport washing when it was happening in Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, right? And I think that one of the many reasons I adore Lewis Hamilton is that, when F1 goes racing in Saudi Arabia, he makes it a point to wear his rainbow helmet, but he also wears it in Miami, right? He also uses it to say, like, I can't speak out against their anti-LGBTQ policies here and act like Florida is the basin of like all progressivism, right? It doesn't ring true, but there's a way that we've I won't say only, but there's a way that we talk about sport washing still. It's in its infancy because we still only talk about it in a global way. When it's also happening domestically, to Jules's point, we get to watch the effects of that, right? Is the message happening domestically? And it can happen domestically with like a local sport, right? And I think that is where the conversation has started to shift, which is really impressive about how information is flowing.
So I might be a slight outlier in this and that. I'm still not really sure exactly how I feel about the term sports washing, because take Qatar for example. There are all kinds of issues there. Yet by hosting the World Cup, they had the spotlight on them for almost a decade, right, in the build-up. And there was improvement in some of their laws and policies on human rights issues, on the workers' issues. Slow. Was it what we would want it to be? No. Were there still people dying? Yes. So, they weren't necessarily trying to obscure that record. And as a result of hosting, they do have a better record today than they did, 10 years ago on these issues. So I'm still kind of feeling my way through how I feel about the term sports washing, because most of the times when I read the critiques of it, it is with regards to the non-Western world.
Yeah, it reminds me of a term like ideology, right? We have values, they have ideology, right? Sports washing is what they, whoever they might be, does. I think it'll be interesting, given that it's a relatively new term, and that it is now gaining some currency in popular media, to see if the term gets absorbed somehow and morphed in terms of what it might apply to.
Yeah, and so my kind of thinking on this, it was informed a lot by a conference I went to in Taiwan last year, where there are a lot of people from East Asia as well as Oceania and Australia. And they were making these points that, you know, you can't really talk about sports washing when it's not used equally to everyone, right? It's in the eye of the beholder in so many of these conversations. And, you know, that there was a certain Western racism and all sorts of things associated with it. But
We'll see if it keeps that same energy for LA 28 and for the World Cup 26. Like, I think that's going to be that
the
sticking
changeover.
point. Exactly.
So we're getting close to the point where I want to make sure that you all have time for some questions from the audience. So again, please be thinking about those. Let me throw two quick things at the panel. One is, if we haven't had a chance for you to talk about a project, an initiative that you are involved in that you think can shed some light on this conversation, I want to give you the opportunity to do that. And then second, what is the single context, issue, environment that you'll be focused on, say, let's just give it the coming year or two, if you want to stretch the calendar a little bit. What is first and foremost on your mind for each of you?
I'm like, I keep going first, so I'm trying not to go first.
That's the benefit of sitting on the edge.
Okay. Well, okay, so for me, I'm very excited. As the shirt reads, we've just started a new, at San Diego State University, our new Center for Skateboarding, Action Sports, and Social Change. And I can say it's the first in the world that has skateboarding in the title, and that is what it's focused on, and how action sports can be a site to create change around the world. And so I work with, anyone here heard of Tony Hawk before? Tony Hawk? Okay. A few people? Okay. I'm just messing with you. Okay. No, but there's always a few that don't. But so I work with Tony Hawk and the Skate Park Project. So traditionally, what we do at the Skate Park Project is help skate parks get built in the U.S. But as we're thinking about skateboarding's role in diplomacy, where skateboarding is for the Olympics, we're about to do an expansion internationally. And it's one of those opportunities that we have to, like, how do we get these things right? How do we make sure that we're working with the right partners on the ground? How do we make sure that we are taking care of skateboarding and the ideals and the ways that we want it to flourish, as opposed to just, you know, some other figures coming in to work on it. And then I also work with Skatistan, and then also a group called the Good Push. And the Good Push is basically, there's 250 different skateboarding, what we say is skateboarding activism or skateboarding social NGOs around the world, where we're helping fund and make sure in every country that there's people who are doing good work. Like, one of the initiatives is pushing against racism, making sure that when you are doing that work that you're being aware of how you can actually make a change in your country, or your nation, or your town. So that's where we're at. So that's a lot for the next year. Oh, and the Olympics, so we'll be there too.
Oh, that. Yeah. We can go order, sure.
Okay, so I sort of feel like I just need to pause for a second and let you know that I really like sports a lot, and it's been like a big part of my life. I feel like I might have come across as like this grumpadelic academic right here. I used to play sports a lot, played soccer at a high level, played professional soccer, represented the U.S. national team, under 23 team. So like, I love sports, and I think with sports have great power, but with that power comes great responsibility, and I'm here to try to press those people running sport to really live up to that responsibility. A lot of my research is based on kind of a ground-up analysis of the Olympic Games. I don't necessarily go talk to the people running these organizations and give more space to what they have to say. I know what they have to say, plus they might not want to talk to me at this point. I go and talk to actual people that are marginalized in society, heavily racialized populations. We're in Olympic city after Olympic city. I lived in Rio de Janeiro before and during those Olympics and talked to people in favelas who are being displaced by the games. I lived in London before and during the Olympics and talked to, again, people who are getting displaced, people who had surface-to-air missiles ratcheted onto their rooftops and got a little slip of paper under their door saying, oh, by the way, we put missiles on top of your roof to protect the Olympics. So I'm really interested in how these big festivals of sports that we all watch and enjoy affect everyday people who don't get to hold a microphone at an event like this one. And so this summer I'll be going to Paris, and I will certainly be following the exciting machinations of Dr. Williams here. But I know I was just there in December for a couple weeks, and I work with on-the-ground activist groups, and one in particular, this group of folks from Médecins du Monde. They have a program called La Reverse de la Médaille, sorry for butchering that, the other side of the medal. And they're doing really interesting and important work around unhoused people in Paris and what's happening with them. Short story, they're getting put on buses and sent to the interior of the country, and good luck to you. So I'll be kind of reporting. I will be reporting with my good friend and writing partner, Dave Zirin, for The Nation magazine. So I'm really excited to be on the ground in Paris this summer. So you might look out for that.
Well, obviously I'm looking forward to Formula 1. But no, I'm really looking forward to the new season of Athletes Unlimited, and I think that it gives a model of, like, bless you, what it looks like to rethink these sporting structures. So Athletes Unlimited is in its now 3rd season. It has women's basketball, lacrosse, and softball. And it is really interesting because it scores things differently. So you don't play on teams, right? You play individually. They repick teams every week, like fascinating, like a schoolyard ball. There's a lot of, politics and fun kind of drama in that. They stream it on YouTube each week, so you can watch who gets picked first and last. It's great. And then you get points based on, like, you obviously get points if you score, but you also get points if you steal the ball, if you assist, right? You lose points if you miss. You lose points if you get a foul. And so it's like a new model of scoring. But the reason I really like Athletes Unlimited is because they've really fused a social kind of justice framework into the fabric of their league. So it's very common to hear about what each player is playing for, to hear about their partnerships with local organizations. At halftime, there's usually a book giveaway on, like, whatever reading topic the league is emphasizing. And it's just a really great model of, like, how they're actually thinking about partnership with local places. They partner with local bookshops to do the reading list that players have recommended. And it's a mix of WNBA players and other players who've played around the league, some up-and-coming players. And they play in Dallas, which is really great. So if you ever find yourself in Dallas over the next month, the season's about to start, check out a game. It's in Fair Park, and it's, top basketball, great skill, and a lot of shit talking. It's wonderful. But it's awkward because then you could be on their team the next week, right? But I do think that the model of sports and the way they're rethinking sports, especially women's sports in this particular moment, is just really interesting to watch. So Athletes Unlimited, their basketball season is about to start, and it's something I'm really excited about.
Thanks for the hoops handoff. That was very on topic. So I am, as your favorite new French sports specialist, I'm looking forward to Paris 2024, particularly the Olympic basketball tournament, not necessarily because it's an Olympics, but because it is going to be on fire for both the men and the women's. The best of the world are going to be there, not just hopefully a gold medal matchup between Teams USA and France, but South Sudan is there for the first time. I think the Nigerian women just qualified. All kinds of super interesting, exciting storylines on the women's side, on the men's side, on the 3x3 side, which is going to be awesome and being played on Place de la Concorde, right outside the American Embassy, alongside skating and
yes, indeed, we'll be right there together.
breakdancing, right? So I'm super excited for the basketball component of that, less about the whole Olympic side, but more about the, how it speaks to globalization of the game, kind of getting back to one of our earlier themes and that connective tissue, because basketball globally is a family. It's a culture, community, and family. That's a conversation for a different time. And kind of working hand in hand with that is a initiative that I direct called France and Us, which looks at the sports stories between French athletes and US athletes or coaches and media members and so forth. So tracing the transatlantic relationship through sports diplomacy over time, past, present, and the rising generation, through the stories of individuals. So building up an archive of that ahead of the 250th anniversary of the official diplomatic alliance, which coincides with the 2028 games and the end of the linked Paris-LA summer cycle.
So this may stretch the definition of sports somewhat, or maybe it doesn't, especially in one context. But I'm a dad of 14-year-old twin boys, and I work with really brilliant 18 to 24-year-old students. And if you watch what they do, man, they're playing a lot of video games. And so I'm thinking a lot about video games. And I think it has the same type of power as traditional sports. And I'll give you two examples that I've been thinking about. On the positive end, I like golf. And so I downloaded a golf game onto my iPhone. And the very first time I played somebody from Latvia. You can see the flag of the person you're playing against and where they're from, and you can text with them. So I found myself texting with this guy, and we stopped playing golf and just started texting. And I said, he asked where I was from, and I said I was from Texas, and he wanted to know if I had a ranch. Well, my family does have a ranch, and I don't think in my life met anybody from that country before. And so, man, how powerful is that? On the other end of the spectrum, I watch what my kids are playing, and they love these battle games. And it reminds me of some of Mike does some really brilliant stuff on militarism and sport. And watching what they play really reminds me of what you do. And, there's a really negative aspect to that as well. They're literally playing war games. And they're communicating. It is amazing what they can do in communicating across the world with other players who are either trying to kill them or trying to help them kill somebody else virtually. And so that tension between the positive and the negative, I think, is what's been really interesting to me right now.
This is all great stuff. We've got a little bit of time for some questions from the audience. We have just the handheld mic, so I will come to you if you have a question. So where can we begin? All right.
If you're from Boston or you're wearing a Red Sox, you have to say something, because we have two people who are Massachusetts. So our Mass folks have to represent. So if that's you, you should.
Well, three of us are from.
Oh, there you go. Look at that.
When you talk about the kind of like the big three, I guess, of like corrupt international sports organizations, like the FIA, the Olympics, FIFA, if you notice where they're kind of trending over the next couple of years, there's going to be 3 Formula One races in the United States, like an 1/8 of the schedule. The FIFA World Cup, the Olympic Games in Los Angeles. Why do you think these organizations are choosing the United States? And do you think that's a reflection on them, a reflection on the United States? Do you think we'll see some sports washing? Just what are your overall thoughts on why these organizations are coming to the U.S.?
It's the money.
Yes.
It is the money. They see the U.S. market as the cash cow, to put it very bluntly, and to tap into it, particularly FIFA. The great hope from the last time U.S. hosted a FIFA World Cup on the men's side was that it would really spark this whole, bright new world of soccer, football, which it did to a certain extent, but not in the way that they really want it to now, to take off financially, kind of along the lines of, how Messi has injected a whole lot of attention and valuation to Inter Miami. So money is one of the prime reasons for that. I'll let you.
Absolutely money. Big, huge money. But I think that we can already see some of the answers to this. So the Las Vegas Grand Prix is just a shit show, and it's delightful because it gives us so much to chew on, right? So why does Las Vegas get a Grand Prix, and why is it locked in for so many years? Very much money. The ticket prices for that are astronomical compared to the other races. It's ridiculous, right? People who live in Vegas could go to any other Grand Prix basically, except maybe a few, but most other Grand Prix for the weekend for cheaper than attending it there, right? But you saw with that, a lot of the sport washing we talk about already happening, and greenwashing, right? So the trees on the strip, what happened to them, right? They get chopped down. The displacement, the militarization, like these things. And it's not just the Grand Prix, because Las Vegas just hosted the Super Bowl. So we get to see the kind of ways that these spaces are doing a blueprint for how sports can be used to transform the area, whether it's this idea that we're going to infuse capital into the area, or what happens because we're inviting this in. And then the Las Vegas Grand Prix, for those who don't know, was so delightful because they also put the times, like they're catering to a US market, but they're scared to lose their other traditional markets. So the race times made no sense for American audience. And then also, within the first 9 minutes, you had, what's it called? A water drain thing pop up and take out a Ferrari. That meant all the fans had to leave and not be let in to the practice session that they paid an astronomical amount of money to see. And it was just like the perfect way to, like, actually, not gonna lie, the race itself was interesting that everybody didn't think it would be. But I think that it's a model because you see more conversation around more street circuits. We're going into the longest race calendar that we're seeing. The United States is absolutely the kind of site of like all this money, because what happens when you do a Netflix series and you get viewership, you open up markets in a way that then why we have Breakpoint and Full Swing and Quarterback and all of these kind of models, right? Because it worked so well for that. So I think that we're already starting to see that. We're going to continue to see it in overdrive for the World Cup and for LA 28, which we've already been kind of dealing with really since '84, if we're going to be honest. So I think that there's a lot to watch in that space, but money is your short answer.
It was much more fun when Austin had the only F1 race in the country. Other questions from our audience? Yeah, I'm going to come all the way over here, and then I'll come back up to you.
So much. First off, go Red Sox. Secondly, I wanted to know your guys' opinion on the NFL potentially expanding internationally and what you think that will do for sports diplomacy.
I have very strong feelings that the NFL is not the real football, but I understand the reasoning for wanting to do this. The great difficulty the NFL has in sports diplomacy, by and large, is that it is not played in most any other part of the world. And so when you go and do programming, or even if you try to do clinics, you're not able to go and do something that's sustainable in a way that makes an impact in the way that other types of initiatives can, whether they're programming clinics or more long-term programs that build those rapport. One of the things I argue is that within the basketball world, not just France, US, but other countries, US, the sports diplomacy bonds are there because it's generation after generation that plays the game and kind of learns and discusses through that. You don't have that same ability with NFL football, except in a very few places. I think there is a real possibility that there could be a team in a London market because of its owner. And when you look at the time differential in terms of taking a flight from one side of the US to the other, it's equivalent from doing, Eastern time zone over to London, so feasible. But it's very difficult for the NFL to do the same kinds of sports diplomacy that the W or the NBA or MLB are able to do and to do with greater impact.
I also think, just adding on to this, we had this discussion this week, and looking at the NFL, they were in Accra and in Ghana, and it's like, okay, first of all, one of the things that also hurts the NFL is like, when I'm going to do a skateboarding diplomacy program anywhere, the body you have is the right body. Like that's like the most key thing is like whatever you got, it's fine. It's fine. I have worked with skaters who have disabilities, use to the legs or other parts of their body, but the one you have works for you in skating. But in the NFL, you're requiring specific bodies to be doing that labor, right? And so that's also part of the discussion. Like the NFL is owners and labor, right? And so when I saw that commercial, I was like, oh, they're just more labor, right? Like, how are we going to get more people interested? But also, like, can we recruit some more labor? How can that go on? So even using it as a real tool for sports diplomacy, I see it as it's a tool for business interests, which is fine because we can't have sport for entertainment. Like all of that is true, but for sports diplomacy, it's like, well, you've got someone. I'm just making it up. This person's 300 pounds. This person's 150. There's just all the things that happen in NFL in general in the game. It's gonna make it more difficult. And it's not, we can't do a clinic in the exact same way, not to really play the game to get us to the NFL, right? So it's going to be an endeavor. And most of the students in my class, they're like, Professor, this is probably going to fail because it's going to take a lot of money for a while to do this. Or they'll just get bored if they're not getting the labor quickly. And I was like, you're a good class, I mean, but maybe it'll be better. I don't know, but
Also,
at least
football
for
is
them.
declining domestically, and so they have to go overseas because people are stopping to play here.
Oh yeah, and the concussions, right? We didn't even talk about like that part of like the labor, the bodies, and that piece that ran. I did have him read first was that the NFL rules the concussion breakdown and the lawsuit that black players were inherently not as smart as white players, so that they didn't deserve as much money from the funding that came from the concussions and that research. So that's how we started the semester. So by the time we get to like the NFL just showing itself out there, like, oh, we're going to Ghana, they're like, so you gonna hurt a bunch of people,
So we are pretty much at the limit of time, but I know we had two more hands, so I want to try to get real quickly those last two questions in, if everybody's cool with that.
So still on the corruption topic, do you think there's a difference between the fact that like the IOC and FIFA are like non-profit organization compared to Formula One, which is like owned by like organization which is on the stock market, so they actually have investors, and they might make some decision because they want to keep investors and
Yeah, well, this is why I'm fascinated with the FIB and like Formula One, because they don't pretend, right? They're just like, we're goons and we like money, right? And with FIFA and with the IOC, like what you pointed out, a lot of, to me, the corruption and the analysis there is precisely because of their nonprofit status. While it's profitable.
Yeah, it's such an insightful question, and I think just going off of what Dr. Davis was saying, I mean, for nonprofit organizations, they are mighty profitable, and I think we always need to keep that in mind. And it seems like the way that you're asking the questions is really keeping an eye on the money shuffle, and I think you can do a lot to really understand sports by doing that. I would say that corruption around these organizations, I'll just take the IOC and FIFA, has been an endemic problem for a really long time. I mean, we kind of started it here in the United States with sort of next level corruption around the Salt Lake City Olympic bid in 2002, where they were giving out like knee replacements to the family members of IOC members, full tuition and scholarships to the kids of IOC members, brand new violins, tickets to the Jazz basketball games. Nagano, the previous Olympics, had done something kind of similar, but they incinerated all their records. Lest we think that, so we don't even know the full extent of it, lest we think that this is just some blast from the past, France has 4 open corruption investigations around the money shuffle with the Olympics in Paris this summer. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So I like the impulse thumping beneath your question and a lot of the insights you've shared.
That's why the FIA, like I said, it's a power game, but they're not like, Liberty Media is like, we're going to Vegas because it's going to bring us money. Right? Like, it's not like this pretend, like, sport. Yeah, like, we love this. And it's, they don't have to do as much dressing up.
But again, we do like sports. Okay.
Yeah, I love it.
We love it. We love it.
Firstly, I really enjoy the symposium. And my question is, in 2021, I think in the Tokyo Olympics, I think in gymnastics, I remember a Japanese player won the gold medal, but the Chinese audience didn't agree. Like, they thought the referees were not fair, and he won because he was in the nationality of the host. So there was a heated discussion and quarrel on social media platforms, which resulted in nationalism. So my question is, do you really think, like, in the digital, like in the polarized society now, the international sports or the Olympics still unite the world, or just aggravate the polarization? Yeah.
That's a great question. Go ahead.
I would say it's not unique to the international sporting world. I've never been angrier than when I'm watching UT play Oklahoma in football. I'm not sure I felt united with my northern friends And I would say that, you know, we shouldn't expect international sport to have that power to bring us together. Although we share the past, there is an inherent competition that you can't escape. And so to some extent I can understand that degree of tension.
But to be truly great athlete, team, you need a truly great rival, right? And so even though there's a little bit of tension within that, there's also the appreciation that if your rival is upping their game, you know, you're going to rise to the challenge as well. So it can unite in a weird way like that, perhaps a different way that we might think about that.
I also think there's a great purchase in sporting communities, whether it's fan communities, whether it's new things we're seeing like in Portland where Jules is like the sports bar, I can't say. Thank you. Sports bar. It's a sports bar that shows women's sports. And there's a play about bar and bra. So it's some way of that, okay? But that is a community, a sporting community, where people who go to that bar have fierce rivalries in terms of who they root for, right? But like to consume it in that space. This is the last thing I promise I'll say about Formula One, but like I've actually really enjoyed, besides from like maybe the Italian races, right? It's very common to see, like, especially in Austin, when nobody's like a organic F1 fan. So seeing all, like, when we were there, we were like, oh, there's real Haas fans in real life. It's weird, right? But you have that. I spend more time than I'll admit to on F1 Reddit, which is global. And everybody's like united in their nerddom about like looking at telemetry. Like, I love that. I love that sporting community, right? And I think that there are ways that we are both, yes, aggravated, Twitter or whatever the hell it is, particularly like aggravating space, right? But there's also spaces in sports communities that continue to flourish and new ones that pop up, right? Like I'm a Manchester United fan. Like there's a Manchester United group in Austin that meets at a bar, like obscene hours, right? Because we're living in Texas and we have to get up at like 8 to 1. I mean, actually, United has been playing at like really respectable times this season. But generally, like we're like at 8 in the morning, like, hi! And that's really interesting. Austin FC is a great model of that. Like, here's a new professional franchise in the city. What does that mean? What is fan culture? What does supporter culture look like around that? And I think that those spaces and those possibilities are the ones that I really love to continue to pour into and see emerge and maybe carry with it the possibility of sporting futures. Yeah. Oh, well, you know, good on you.
Bring us home, Jules.
Really quick, I think right in the core of your question is the issue of political nationalism. And one thing I'll just leave you with is the Olympics don't necessarily have to be organized in a way that inflames political nationalism. Think about the opening ceremonies when you watch them this summer. Everyone's going to go on these ferry boats down the Seine by country. They could have all the skateboarders come in together, all the pole vaulters come in together. There are other ways of organizing society, and I think we're beyond time where we have to start thinking outside the box to do things in a more productive socially way.
My favorite language from the Olympic Charter is that the Olympic Games are competitions between athletes, not nations. Nobody believes that. So. But these are all amazing responses and observations. Can we please all give a round of applause to our guests? So again, thank you so much to Dr. Williams, Dr. Boykoff, Dr. Davis, Dr. Krasnoff, Dr. Hunt. Thank you all for being here. Please look for more Center for Sports Communication and Media events in the future. In fact, the next one will be the Frank DeFord Lecture in Sports Journalism. Gerald Early, distinguished professor and writer, will be here to deliver that on March 27th, so look for that. And thank you so much for staying a few minutes late. We really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.